All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that honestly kind of blew my mind when I first came across it. We're talking about how some of the wealthiest people out there think Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, have reportedly paid zero, zip, nada in federal income tax in certain years.
It is pretty wild when you think about the sheer scale of their wealth, right?
Exactly. So we've got a stack of reports, analyses, all sorts of stuff to try and unpack how this is even possible legally. We dug into investigative pieces like that ProPublica report, delved into the tax code itself, and looked at the bigger picture of wealth inequality.
And the goal here isn't to pass judgment or anything, but to really understand the nuts and bolts of how the U.S. tax system makes this possible.
Exactly. So let's get into it. One of the big things that kept popping up was this idea of borrowing against wealth.
Yeah, yes.
Instead of selling assets like stocks, which would, trigger those capital gains taxes, these billionaires could basically take out loans using their holdings as collateral. It's like accessing the money without actually selling and creating a taxable event.
Right, you're essentially leveraging the value of those assets without triggering a sale. And the key here is that the current tax code doesn't consider the growth of wealth in assets as taxable income until those assets are sold. So those gains just keep growing, completely tax-free, until they're realized.
Unrealized gains, that's the term.
Exactly. And this is where the strategy of borrowing becomes so powerful for these individuals. They can access huge amounts of money without having to sell their assets and therefore without those immediate tax implications.
Makes sense. We also saw how charitable donations and deductions fit into the picture.
Right. So charitable giving plays a big role too, because donating to charities can significantly reduce your taxable income, especially when you're talking about donating appreciated assets, which can be a pretty significant advantage. And then there are things like private foundations, which get pretty complex, but essentially allow for tax deductions while often maintaining some level of family control over those funds.
So it's not just about avoiding taxes, but also strategically reducing them through these various mechanisms.
Exactly. And then you add in the factor of unrealized capital gains. We're talking about wealth that can grow massively in the stock market, but as long as those assets aren't sold, it's not taxed the same way as, say, a regular salary.
And even when they do decide to sell, those long-term capital gains are taxed at a lower rate, right?
Much lower than your typical income tax rates, which makes a huge difference when your wealth primarily comes from appreciating assets. I mean, the difference in tax burden compared to someone earning the same amount through a salary is substantial.
Yeah, that was really driven home by that ProPublica report, which had some pretty specific examples, like how Jeff Bezos apparently didn't pay any federal income tax in 2007 and 2011, and Elon Musk in 2018. Zero income tax, while their wealth was skyrocketing.
It's important to emphasize, though, that all of this is happening within the bounds of the law. The sources we looked at make it clear that these are all legal strategies, even if they seem counterintuitive to many people.
Yeah, so it's not about doing anything illegal, but more about understanding the intricacies of the system. So for our listeners, the big takeaways here are that there are ways, perfectly legal ways, for the ultra-wealthy to minimize or completely eliminate their federal income taxes. And it often boils down to leveraging the untaxed growth of their assets through borrowing and smart use of deductions.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the real question to ponder is, knowing all of this, what do you think about how wealth and income are taxed in the U.S.? What does it mean for the rest of us, for society as a whole? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and we encourage you to keep exploring this topic and thinking critically about the tax system and its impact on wealth inequality.
Absolutely. Food for thought for sure. All right, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.